Well, I think the Arab Spring was one of the most significant events of contemporary history. Did it succeed? We don't really know. I think it's a work in progress. If you take a look, it varied from country to country. It actually began in Western Sahara. Nobody talks about that, but they should. That's a country it's kind of like Palestine. It's under foreign military occupation, violation of international law. It was crushed very quickly by Morocco. But the first part of the Arab Spring that kind of enters history was shortly after in Tunisia. Tunisia is mainly under French influence from the external side, and the French tried to crush it. They were supporting the dictator Ben Ali, even after he'd been expelled, they continued to support him. They failed. It took roots, and it's had moderate success. I mean, I think there's improvements, and it's has positive implications for the future. The next major case was Egypt, the most important country in the region. And there what happened, I think, was very dramatic and quite exciting. It's not just what caught media attention, Tahrir Square, although that was very important. There was also, there's a long background of a labor movement activism in Egypt, crushed by the regime, but significant. In fact, well, I don't have to tell you, but April 6th was named after the participation in a major strike in the big industrial centers. And that continued. And it's had some consequences, which maybe are lasting. It seems to have given a kind of an opening for the first time to independent unions. There have been continuation of labor actions, a lot of them crushed by force. Force hasn't ended by any means. But that, I think, continued. It opened a space for discussion, which I think is probably going to have a lasting effect on the culture and the society. The important external forces in that case were primarily the United States, secondarily England. Typically, they followed the usual procedure. There's a standard procedure when your favorite dictator gets into trouble. It's followed all the time. Somoza, Marcos, Duvalier, long list of cases. Support him as long as possible. When it becomes impossible, because maybe the army's turned against him or the business classes have turned against him, then issue ringing declarations about your love for democracy, send your dictator off somewhere, in this case Sharm el-Sheikh, and then try to reinstitute the same system as much as you can. That happens with such regularity that it's kind of astonishing that the intellectual and scholarly world somehow can't see it. And that's what happened in Egypt. There was, I won't go through the details, but there was finally a reaction, a military coup. It's driving Egypt into some of its worst days maybe ever, and it's supported by the United States, tepidly, like they don't say we love you, but they're supporting it. If you go to other countries, the major countries from the Western point of view, the most important countries are the oil-producing dictatorships. There, the first efforts at reform were just crushed violently. I mean, there were in Saudi Arabia, the most important. There were some attempts to do what was being done elsewhere, you know, things happening after the Friday prayers. The police response was so overwhelming that people were afraid to go into the streets in Riyadh. In one country, Bahrain, it did make some progress, and Saudi Arabia sent an army in to crush it, mainly out of concern for the Shia areas in eastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil happens to be, and they want to make sure they keep that repressed. And the same elsewhere, it just couldn't get off the ground in the oil dictatorships. Syria, the early steps were met with a vicious response by the Assad regime, which not long after elicited a violent uprising. By now the country is practically destroyed. It may not survive. A huge number of the population is just fleeing in desperation. It's led to a confrontation between the brutal Assad regime on the one hand and the murderous jihadi organizations, which are more or less similar in ideology, though they're fighting turf battles, ISIS, al-Nusra Front, Ahrar, so it's just a total disaster. What will happen out of all of this? I think it's very hard to predict, just as nobody could have predicted the Arab Spring. But my guess is that when the fragments sort of fall into place, there'll be a revival of the forces that led to the Arab Spring in the first place. And it's not the first time, after all. There's been effort after effort in the Arab and Muslim worlds to move towards democracy and development, almost always crushed by external force, case after case.